In the heart of London stands a fortress of stone and shadow, the Tower of London. For centuries, it has been a symbol of royal power, imprisonment, and death. But among all its dark legends, one mystery rises above the rest. It is not the tale of a tyrant king or a fallen noble, but of two children who walked inside its walls and were never seen again. In the summer of 1483, two princes, Edward V, the rightful King of England, and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, entered the Tower under the protection of their uncle. They were boys, not soldiers, heirs, not enemies. England was told they would remain there only briefly, waiting for a coronation that would never come. At first, they were seen playing in the gardens, waving from windows, laughing like any children would. Then, slowly, the sightings stopped. Days turned to weeks, weeks turned to silence. No announcement was made, no funeral bells rang. The future kings of England simply vanished. Were they murdered in the night, betrayed by blood, or erased by politics too dangerous to challenge? 500 years later, their fate remains unknown. This is the story of ambition, power, and a crime history has never solved: the princes in the Tower.
England in the late 15th century was a kingdom bruised by bloodshed. For more than 30 years, the Wars of the Roses had torn the country apart, a brutal civil conflict between two branches of the same royal family, the House of York and the House of Lancaster. Battles were fought not on distant frontiers, but on English soil, where neighbors faced neighbors, and loyalty could mean death. Kings rose and fell with alarming speed. Nobles shifted allegiances to survive. Treachery became a tool of politics, and violence a language everyone understood. Even when peace appeared to return, it was fragile, held together by fear rather than trust. England had learned that crowns were not inherited safely. They were seized, defended, and stolen. By the 1470s, the House of York seemed victorious. Edward IV sat firmly on the throne, a strong warrior king who had crushed his enemies and restored a sense of order. Trade revived, the court glittered once more, and the long nightmare of civil war appeared to be ending. But beneath the surface, old wounds remained unhealed. Powerful families remembered their losses. Rivals waited patiently for opportunity. The greatest danger was uncertainty. England had seen what happened when a weak ruler took the crown. A child king meant vulnerability, a vacuum where ambition rushed in. Every noble knew that power lay not only in armies, but in proximity to the throne itself. This was the world into which Edward IV's sons would step, a world where mercy was rare, promises were temporary, and family ties could be sacrificed for survival. The Wars of the Roses may have ended on paper, but their shadow still darkened every corridor of power. In such a kingdom, innocence was not protection. It was a liability.
Edward IV was not a king shaped by ceremony alone. He was forged on the battlefield. Tall, charismatic, and physically imposing, he embodied the ideal medieval warrior. He won his crown not through inheritance, but through force, defeating rivals in brutal combat during the Wars of the Roses. To his supporters, he was a hero who restored stability. To his enemies, a reminder that power belonged to the strongest hand. As king, Edward IV brought a rare period of calm to a fractured England. He strengthened royal authority, encouraged trade, and surrounded himself with loyal men who had fought beside him. The court became lively again, filled with tournaments, feasts, and confidence that the bloodshed of civil war was finally over. Many believed Edward's reign marked the end of dynastic chaos. But Edward IV was more than a warrior. He was a father. His marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was controversial, uniting the king with a noblewoman outside the great power families. Together, they had many children, and Edward showed genuine affection toward them, particularly his eldest son, Prince Edward. He prepared the boy carefully for kingship, surrounding him with tutors and advisors, teaching him how to rule wisely rather than rule through fear. Yet Edward's greatest strength was also his greatest weakness. He assumed the future would follow his plans. He trusted that his brother, Richard of Gloucester, would protect his sons. He believed the crown he had fought so hard to secure was now safe within his bloodline. Then, in April 1483, Edward IV fell suddenly ill and died at just 40 years old. His death shocked the kingdom. There was no long decline, no time to prepare fully for the transition of power. Overnight, England was once again ruled by uncertainty. The warrior king was gone. In his place stood a 12-year-old heir and a court where ambition never slept. Edward IV had won a crown through war, but he left behind children who would inherit its dangers without its armor. In April 1483, England awoke to shocking news. King Edward IV was dead. Only weeks earlier, he had appeared strong and confident, still a man in the prime of life at just 40 years old. His death came suddenly, without warning, and without the slow preparation that kingdoms depended upon for survival. One moment, England had a proven warrior king. The next, it had a child heir and a dangerous void at the center of power. Accounts of Edward's final days are uncertain. Some chroniclers claimed he fell ill after a period of heavy feasting and exhaustion. Others whispered darker rumors, poison, betrayal, or divine punishment for past sins. No clear diagnosis was ever recorded. In an age without modern medicine, sudden death was both common and deeply suspicious, especially when it reshaped the fate of a nation. Edward died at Westminster on April 9, 1483. Almost immediately, fear spread through the royal court. The king's eldest son, Prince Edward, was only 12 years old and living far from London. His younger brother, Richard, was even more vulnerable. The boys were heirs to the throne, but also potential obstacles to any man who desired power. Edward IV had attempted to plan for this moment. He named his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector, trusting him to safeguard the realm and his sons until the coronation. On paper, it was a sensible decision. Richard was experienced, loyal in war, and respected by the nobility. But paper promises meant little in a kingdom shaped by ambition. As Edward IV's body lay prepared for burial, alliances began to shift. Noble families calculated their next move. Old grudges resurfaced. The fragile peace Edward had built began to crack almost instantly. The king was gone, but the struggle he thought he had ended was about to begin again. And this time, it would place two children at the center of England's most dangerous game. Edward V was only 12 years old when destiny placed a crown above his head. Born into privilege yet surrounded by danger, he had been raised not merely as a prince, but as a future ruler. From an early age, he was described as intelligent, serious beyond his years, and keen to learn the responsibilities of kingship. Those who taught him believed he would grow into a thoughtful and capable monarch if he lived long enough to rule. Much of Edward's childhood was spent away from court at Ludlow Castle on the edge of the Welsh Marches. There, under the guidance of his maternal uncle, Anthony Woodville, he received a careful education in governance, law, and morality. His upbringing was designed to shield him from the intrigues of London while preparing him for the realities of power. But that distance would soon leave him vulnerable. When news of his father's death reached him in April 1483, Edward instantly became king in name, though not in authority. England now belonged to a child. According to custom, Edward was to travel to London for his coronation, where he would be crowned Edward V. Every step of that journey, however, was heavy with risk. Powerful men would control the boy, and through him, the kingdom itself. Edward is often forgotten because he never reigned, never issued laws, and never led armies. Yet in 1483, he was the most important person in England. His existence determined who ruled, who fell, and who survived. To some, he was the rightful king to be protected. To others, he was an obstacle that stood between ambition and the throne. Edward V did not know it, but his childhood was already ending. Ahead lay not a coronation of triumph, but a silent descent into history's darkest mystery. Richard, Duke of York, was only 9 years old when the shadow of history closed around him. Too young to understand the forces shaping his fate, he lived in the world of childhood, lessons, play, and the quiet assurance that his family's power would protect him. As the younger son of King Edward IV, Richard was not born to rule, yet his royal blood made him just as dangerous as his brother in a kingdom ruled by ambition. Unlike Edward, Richard spent much of his early life under the care of his mother, Queen Elizabeth Woodville. After the king's death, she sought refuge with her younger children in Westminster Abbey, claiming sanctuary from political enemies. There, Richard was shielded from the immediate chaos gripping the court, unaware that decisions were being made that would determine whether he lived or disappeared. Contemporary descriptions suggest Richard was bright and well-mannered, a boy shaped by courtly expectations, but still innocent of intrigue. He idolized his elder brother, the new king, and trusted the adults around him, especially his uncle, Richard of Gloucester, who was presented as the boy's protector. No one told him trust could be a fatal mistake. Unlike Edward V, Richard of York posed no immediate political threat. Yet, in the ruthless logic of medieval power, his very existence was dangerous. As long as he lived, he remained a living symbol of Yorkist legitimacy. If one brother died, the other could still claim the crown. When he was summoned from sanctuary to join Edward in the Tower of London, assurances were given. He would be safe. He would be reunited with his brother. It was said to be temporary. History would record that this was the last time Richard, Duke of York, was seen in the world of the living. A child with no ambition of his own became a silent victim of the ambitions of others, one half of England's most haunting mystery. The moment Edward IV died, the royal court fractured along invisible fault lines. What had once been a carefully balanced circle of power quickly turned into a battleground of influence, suspicion, and fear. At the center of this division stood two rival groups, each claiming to act in the best interest of the young king, yet each determined to control him. On one side were the Woodvilles, the family of Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Raised rapidly after Edward IV's marriage, they held key positions and enormous influence over Prince Edward. To their enemies, the Woodvilles were seen as ambitious outsiders who had risen too quickly and now threatened the old nobility. Their closeness to the boy king made them powerful and therefore dangerous. Opposing them were the traditional Yorkist lords, hardened by years of war and deeply distrustful of the Queen's family. Many of these men had fought beside Richard, Duke of Gloucester, and viewed him as a stabilizing force. To them, The Woodvilles represented corruption, favoritism, and the risk of another weak, manipulated reign. Fear ruled both sides. The Woodvilles feared that without swift action, their enemies would seize Prince Edward and strip them of power, or worse. The Yorkists feared that if the Woodvilles remained dominant, England would fall under the control of men who had not earned loyalty through battle. In the shadows, alliances shifted daily. Courtiers whispered in corridors. Letters were sent in secret. Each faction believed it was defending the kingdom from chaos, even as their rivalry threatened to create it. Caught between them was a 12-year-old king who had yet to be crowned. Edward V became not a ruler, but a prize. In a court divided by distrust and ambition, his safety depended on men who no longer trusted one another. And history shows that such divisions rarely end without blood. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was Edward IV's youngest brother, a man forged by war, loyal to family, and feared for his shrewd mind. At 31, he had spent decades on the front lines of England's brutal civil wars, proving himself a capable general and a careful politician. Yet his entrance into the post-Edward IV power struggle would mark the beginning of history's darkest chapter for the young princes. Richard was called upon to serve as Lord Protector, charged with guiding the kingdom during Edward V's minority. On paper, it was a sensible appointment, a trusted Yorkist, experienced in governance and bound by family loyalty. The nobles and courtiers accepted his role publicly, though whispers of doubt circulated. Richard was ambitious, cautious, and strategic, always aware of the fragile balance of power that could tip with the wrong move. To the public, Richard appeared devoted to his nephew, a guardian ready to protect the boy king. Behind closed doors, however, the court watched him closely. He had the respect of soldiers, the loyalty of key allies, and the means to control London itself. In a kingdom still reeling from decades of bloodshed, these were tools that could either preserve order or destroy a dynasty. Richard's arrival in London set events into motion that no one could reverse. The princes were lodged in the Tower of London under his oversight. The boy king's coronation was delayed, ostensibly for his protection. Yet with each passing day, the court's uncertainty grew, and the young heir's position became increasingly perilous. Richard of Gloucester was more than a mere uncle. He was a figure at the crossroads of duty, ambition, and opportunity. His decisions over the next few weeks would alter the course of England forever, raising questions that have haunted historians for centuries. Protector or predator? Uncle or usurper? The stage was set, the tower awaited, and history prepared to remember what would happen next in silence. After Edward IV's sudden death, England faced a precarious moment. The throne passed to his 12-year-old son, Edward V, a boy too young to rule, leaving the kingdom in a vulnerable state. To safeguard the realm and ensure a smooth transition, Edward IV's will named his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. This appointment placed Richard in a position of immense authority, tasked with guiding the young king and stabilizing the kingdom. On the surface, Richard's role appeared straightforward. As Lord Protector, he was to act in Edward V's best interests, overseeing daily governance, managing the court, and preparing for the boy's coronation. The responsibility also included protecting the princes from the many dangers of political intrigue, a task of extraordinary difficulty given the court's simmering rivalries and the ambitions of powerful nobles. Yet, power has a way of complicating duty. While Richard was officially a guardian, he simultaneously held the means to influence or even control the succession. The line between protector and manipulator blurred quickly in the volatile environment of late 15th century England. Every decision he made was scrutinized by factions, each suspicious of his intentions and each ready to exploit any misstep. For Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of York, this arrangement was a mixture of promise and peril. The Tower of London, where they would reside under Richard's watch, became both sanctuary and prison. Friends and allies feared for their safety, whispering warnings about ambition and betrayal. Yet no one dared challenge Richard openly. As protector of the realm, Richard's influence grew by the day. His control over the princes and the capital allowed him to consolidate power, shaping the kingdom's future in ways no one could yet predict. In the weeks to come, his actions would ignite a mystery that endures to this day: the fate of England's lost princes. After being declared king in name, Edward V began the journey from Ludlow Castle to London, a trip that should have been ceremonial but quickly became fraught with tension. Accompanied by his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, and a retinue of loyal attendants, the boy king traveled through the English countryside, unaware that the very route he followed would carry him toward a historic and tragic turning point. At first, the journey seemed routine. Villages greeted the royal procession with celebration, banners fluttered in the spring breeze, and townspeople cheered for the boy king, excited to see the future of the Yorkist dynasty. Edward appeared calm, riding with dignity despite his youth, but unease simmered beneath the surface. Courtiers whispered in private, alliances shifted, and powerful nobles watched closely, calculating how best to secure their own advantage in the new reign. The atmosphere changed sharply at Stony Stratford, a small town roughly halfway to London. There, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, ordered the arrest of members of the Woodville family, including the young king's maternal uncle. Ostensibly, this action was for the protection of Edward V, but in reality, it shifted control of the boy king into Gloucester's hands. From that moment on, the journey was no longer just a procession. It was a carefully orchestrated maneuver of political power. By the time the princes reached the outskirts of London, the capital itself had become a trap disguised as a welcoming city. Richard's influence over key figures ensured that the boy king's supporters were sidelined, leaving Edward and his brother isolated. What had begun as a journey of celebration transformed into a march toward confinement, uncertainty, and ultimately the disappearance that would mystify England for centuries. The streets of London welcomed Edward V with cheer, but behind the walls of the Tower, fate waited silently, ready to claim two young lives in one of history's most infamous mysteries. The royal procession carrying Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, to London should have been a joyous occasion, a ceremonial passage for England's new king. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most pivotal and ominous moments in English history. At Stony Stratford, a quiet town along the route, the atmosphere shifted dramatically from pageantry to tension. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, now Lord Protector, used the journey to consolidate power. It was here that he made a decisive move: the arrest of key members of the Woodville family, including Anthony Woodville, the young king's maternal uncle, and other allies of Queen Elizabeth. The Woodvilles had risen quickly in Edward IV's court, amassing wealth and influence that made them natural targets for those who sought to control the throne. By removing them from the procession, Gloucester effectively isolated Edward V from his family's protective network, ensuring that the boy king would be dependent on him and his allies. This act of arrest sent shockwaves through the court and the surrounding towns. Nobles who had supported the late king watched uneasily as Gloucester demonstrated his readiness to wield force against even those closest to the boy king. Villagers along the road whispered in fear, unsure whether the arrests were a precaution or the prelude to something darker. For Edward V, the events at Stony Stratford were bewildering. He was a child, relying on adults for guidance, yet now he was surrounded by men whose loyalty was uncertain. His uncle Anthony had been a trusted protector, a mentor, and a link to his mother's family. With him removed, the young king's path to London became a procession not of celebration, but of control and confinement. The arrests at Stony Stratford marked a turning point. What had begun as a ceremonial journey toward coronation transformed into a calculated power play, setting the stage for the disappearance of the princes and a mystery that would haunt England for centuries. The Tower of London has long been a symbol of power, awe, and terror. Built by William the Conqueror nearly 4 centuries earlier, it had served as a fortress, a royal residence, and a prison. By the time Edward V and his younger brother Richard entered its walls in 1483, the tower had already earned a reputation as a place where kings could be crowned and enemies could vanish. Its massive stone walls, imposing towers, and narrow corridors concealed both comfort and danger, depending on the visitor's status and the intentions of those in power. For Edward V, the tower was officially a royal residence, a temporary home before his coronation. He and his brother were lodged in chambers designed for kings, with attendants, servants, and a semblance of safety. Yet the line between palace and prison was fragile. The very walls meant to protect the princes also isolated them from allies and limited their freedom. Every entrance and exit was controlled by men loyal to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, now acting as Lord Protector. The tower's dual nature was clear to anyone who had witnessed its history. Generals, nobles, and even members of the royal family had been confined within its walls, often never to emerge. Executions, secret imprisonments, and disappearances were not uncommon. Its shadowed corridors seemed to hold the whispers of past prisoners, a reminder that power could quickly turn sanctuary into captivity. For the young princes, the tower became a place of both prestige and peril. They were treated as future kings, yet they were powerless. The same walls that offered protection also rendered them vulnerable to ambition and betrayal. Within the tower, the stage was set for a story that would blend royal ceremony with chilling uncertainty. Leaving the world to wonder, was this a palace of kings or a prison for children awaiting an unknown fate? On a gray morning in April 1483, Edward V rode through the gates of the Tower of London, a 12-year-old boy on the threshold of kingship. The city watched with anticipation, banners fluttering and trumpets heralding his arrival, yet few realized the uncertainty that surrounded him. For Edward, the tower was meant to be a temporary residence before his coronation, a place of protection and preparation, but history would remember it differently. Edward entered under the supervision of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, whose title as Lord Protector gave him authority over the young king and the kingdom. The boy's arrival was treated with ceremonial respect. Attendants escorted him to private chambers, meals were prepared, and guards were stationed ostensibly for his safety. Yet the tower's atmosphere was heavy with tension. Every corridor, stairway, and turret could conceal both allies and threats, and Edward was surrounded by men whose ambitions were impossible for a child to gauge. The significance of this moment extended beyond ceremony. By entering the Tower, Edward was physically and politically separated from his family and supporters. His maternal relatives, particularly the Woodvilles, had been detained or sidelined, leaving him isolated. Each step he took through the Tower's shadowed halls placed him deeper into a world governed not by innocence, but by intrigue, loyalty, and fear. Though he was treated as a king, Edward's freedom was limited. The chambers were lavish but controlled, the attendants obedient but monitored, and the outside world visible only through guarded windows. Within these walls, the seeds of history's most enduring mystery were sown. The boy king had entered what was meant to be a sanctuary, but for Edward V, the Tower would become the stage for one of England's darkest enigmas, a place where childhood and royalty collided with ambition, secrecy, and danger. While Edward V settled into the Tower under the careful supervision of his uncle Richard, another summons quietly altered the fate of the royal family. Richard, Duke of York, Edward's younger brother, was brought from sanctuary at Westminster Abbey to join his brother within the Tower's walls. Only 9 years old, Richard had been protected by his mother and her family, shielded from the intrigues of the court. The summons, however, was official and commanded obedience. For the young prince, the journey to the Tower was likely confusing and intimidating. He was guided by men he trusted, or believed he could trust, through the streets of London, a city that cheered for Edward V, yet whispered rumors of danger. Richard's arrival was treated as a reunion of brothers, a symbolic gesture meant to project unity and stability. To the outside world, it was a family affair, both princes together, awaiting the coronation of the elder. Behind the ceremonial facade, the move ensured that the two heirs to the throne were now under the complete oversight of Richard of Gloucester. By bringing the younger prince to the Tower, Gloucester controlled both symbols of Yorkist legitimacy. The boys were no longer protected by their maternal relatives who had been arrested or isolated. The Tower, already a place of confinement for Edward, now became a double fortress, simultaneously sheltering and enclosing both children. The atmosphere inside the Tower shifted with Richard's arrival. Play and study would continue, but every action, every visitor, and every attendant was filtered through the lens of power and surveillance. The young princes were isolated from allies, reliant on adults whose motives could not be fully understood. History records that these were the last days when either boy was seen publicly, and the summons of Richard, Duke of York, marked the beginning of the events that would make their story one of England's greatest unsolved mysteries. Inside the Tower of London, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, found themselves confined within walls that were both protective and foreboding. The massive stone fortress, which had stood for centuries as a symbol of royal authority, now became the stage for a story that would haunt England for generations. For the two boys, it was a place of paradox, a home of privilege and ceremony, yet also a prison under constant watch. In their chambers, the princes lived as young royals, attended by servants and tutors who maintained the semblance of normal life. They studied, played, and went about their daily routines, yet the freedom of childhood was curtailed. Every movement was monitored, every visitor scrutinized. Guards controlled access to their rooms, and the corridors of the Tower echoed with the presence of men whose loyalty was dictated more by politics than by affection. The brothers' isolation was as much psychological as it was physical. They were separated from the protective influence of their mother and her family, who had been removed from the scene through arrests or exile. Outside, the city of London celebrated the ascension of Edward V, unaware that the boy king and his brother were increasingly vulnerable. Within the Tower, whispers of power, conspiracy, and ambition drifted through the stone halls. Despite their youth, the princes likely sensed the unease around them. Courtiers and soldiers moved with purpose, their intentions veiled behind courteous words and ceremonial gestures. The Tower, designed to shelter kings, now contained children caught in the deadly currents of ambition. In these moments, the two brothers were no longer simply heirs, they were pawns in a dangerous game of power. Behind the Tower's walls, history quietly waited, and the fate of Edward and Richard began to take shape, shrouded in secrecy and fear. The coronation of Edward V was meant to be a moment of triumph, a ceremony that would cement his position as the rightful king of England. Yet weeks passed after his arrival at the Tower, and the anticipated event never occurred. Each day brought not celebration, but delay, leaving the boy king trapped between expectation and uncertainty. The streets of London buzzed with speculation, while within the Tower, the prince's world became increasingly insular. The delays were officially attributed to the boy's youth and the logistical challenges of preparing a royal ceremony. Chroniclers noted that officials insisted more time was needed to prepare the city, secure the nobles' attendance, and ensure that the pageantry befitted a king. Yet behind these explanations, tension simmered. Political factions jockeyed for influence, and those closest to Edward V whispered doubts about the intentions of his Lord Protector, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. As the coronation postponed, the atmosphere inside the Tower shifted. The young king and his brother, once accustomed to tutors and attendants, now felt the weight of uncertainty pressing in. Courtiers came and went, but many decisions affecting the princes' lives were made without their knowledge. The boys were isolated from allies who might have protected them, and the Tower's imposing walls became a reminder that their world had narrowed. Each delay strengthened Richard's control. By slowing the coronation, he maintained authority over the kingdom and the young monarch. The boy king's fate was no longer in ceremonial hands. It was tethered to the ambitions of adults who saw opportunity in indecision. The prolonged postponement of the coronation was not merely an administrative matter. It was the first step in a series of moves that would cast a long shadow over Edward and his brother, setting the stage for one of England's most enduring and chilling mysteries. As Edward V remained confined in the Tower of London, a storm of rumor and political intrigue began to swirl around his claim to the throne. Whispers emerged, questioning the legitimacy of Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, suggesting that the union had been invalid in the eyes of both law and church. If true, these claims would render Edward V and his younger brother Richard illegitimate, effectively removing them from the line of succession and casting doubt on the Yorkist claim to the crown. The whispers began among the court's most powerful figures, men with eyes on the throne and ambitions that stretched beyond loyalty. Clergy and nobles alike discussed the possibility quietly, avoiding direct confrontation while carefully planting seeds of doubt. Even outside the Tower, the rumors traveled swiftly. In the taverns and streets of London, commoners debated whether the boy king was truly Edward IV's son, and pamphlets began to circulate, hinting that the heirs might not be the rightful rulers. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized upon the controversy. By allowing and amplifying these whispers, He positioned himself as a defender of the realm, claiming that he acted to preserve the kingdom from the dangers of an illegitimate reign. The narrative suggested that Edward V's claim could not be trusted, giving Gloucester both a justification and a shield for the actions he would soon take. For the princes, the whispers of illegitimacy were invisible yet devastating. Their right to rule, their security, and their very existence as heirs were being undermined by forces beyond their understanding or control. In a court where perception mattered as much as law, doubt became a weapon, and the young kings were powerless to defend themselves. These murmurs would lay the foundation for a political maneuver that forever altered England's history, casting the shadows of betrayal and mystery over the Tower. In the spring of 1483, as Edward V awaited his coronation within the Tower of London, a moment occurred that would change the course of English history. In a grand public ceremony at St. Paul's Cathedral, a sermon was delivered that shook the very foundations of the young king's claim. The preacher, invoking the authority of both church and law, declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid from the start. This declaration meant that Edward V and his younger brother Richard were illegitimate in the eyes of God, the law, and the people. The sermon was more than a theological argument. It was a calculated political act. By questioning the legitimacy of the princes, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, cast doubt on their right to rule, positioning himself as the protector of the realm and the logical alternative for the throne. Courtiers, nobles, and city officials listened intently, absorbing the message with awe, fear, and suspicion. To many, the preacher's words justified a transfer of loyalty and allegiance. For Edward V, the sermon's consequences were profound, though he could scarcely understand them at 12 years old. The narrative that had secured his birthright and prepared him for kingship was suddenly under attack. What had been certain, his status as the rightful heir, was now questioned by law, religion, and public opinion, all powerful forces in medieval England. The public pronouncement fundamentally altered the balance of power. Richard's path to the crown was paved with the authority of God and the law, making resistance difficult. The princes, isolated in the Tower, were powerless to defend themselves against this sudden shift. What began as a religious lecture had become a decisive act of political strategy, setting in motion events that would lead to their disappearance and one of England's most infamous unsolved mysteries. The sermon had done its work. The legitimacy of the boy kings was shattered, and the kingdom stood on the edge of a dark and uncertain future. By the summer of 1483, the stage was set for a monumental and controversial shift in English history. With Edward V's legitimacy publicly questioned and the young king confined within the Tower of London, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, acted decisively. In what would become one of the most infamous moments of the Wars of the Roses, Richard assumed the crown, becoming King Richard III. The act shocked the kingdom and left the prince's fate shrouded in fear and uncertainty. Richard's claim to the throne was framed as a duty rather than ambition. He presented himself as the protector of England, a guardian acting in the best interests of the realm. By declaring Edward V and his brother illegitimate, Richard positioned himself as the rightful ruler, filling the vacuum left by a boy king deemed unfit by law, church, and tradition. To many nobles, weary of instability and bloodshed, his claim seemed practical, even necessary. The coronation itself was a display of both power and inevitability. London watched as Richard entered Westminster Abbey, a man of determination, authority, and cold calculation. Public ceremonies, oaths of loyalty from the nobility, and the support of key clerics lent legitimacy to what was, in essence, a seizure of power from his nephews. Behind the pageantry, however, uncertainty and dread permeated the tower. The young princes remained confined, their future uncertain, their voices unheard in a kingdom now ruled by their uncle. Richard's ascent transformed the political landscape overnight. What had begun as a guardianship became kingship, and England's course was irrevocably altered. The two young heirs, once destined for the throne, were now trapped in history's shadows. Richard's crowning was not merely a transfer of power. It was the moment that ignited one of the greatest mysteries in English history, the disappearance of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, the princes in the Tower. After Richard III assumed the throne, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, faded from public view. The Tower of London, once a royal residence and ceremonial space, became a silent enclosure for the young princes. What had been a home of protection and preparation transformed into a place of uncertainty and fear. The last confirmed sightings of the boys were few and fleeting, leaving contemporaries and history grappling with their sudden absence. At first, the disappearance was subtle. The prince's attendants were restricted, visits were curtailed, and the public was given no explanation. Courtiers whispered in corridors, speculating about the boy's fate, but no one dared speak openly. The tower's imposing walls and guarded gates ensured that the young heirs were completely under the control of Richard III and his closest allies. Even the city outside remained largely unaware of the severity of the situation, though rumors began to spread. The sudden absence of the princes created an immediate power vacuum that consolidated Richard's rule. With the boys unseen, he faced no rival claimants within England, and the nobility gradually accepted his authority. Yet the silence surrounding their fate only fueled fear and suspicion. Was it illness, confinement, or a more sinister plot? Over the following weeks and months, the world outside speculated endlessly, while the children themselves vanished into history. This disappearance became one of the most haunting mysteries of medieval England. Despite later confessions, claims, and rumors, no contemporary records definitively reveal what happened to Edward V and Richard of York. The loss of the princes not only secured Richard III's throne, but also left an enduring question. How and why did England's rightful heirs vanish behind the tower's stone walls? Their disappearance remains a chilling symbol of ambition, betrayal, and the vulnerability of innocence in the ruthless world of medieval power. As summer passed after Richard III's coronation, the absence of Edward V and his younger brother Richard did not go unnoticed. The streets of London, once filled with excitement for the young king's ascension, began to buzz with uneasy whispers. Merchants, citizens, and members of the court started asking questions. Where were the princes? Why had they vanished from public view? The city, a center of trade and gossip, became a place where fear and suspicion spread as quickly as news. Initially, rumors were cautious and fragmented. Some claimed the boys were ill, others suggested they had been sent to relatives for safety. Yet the lack of any official statement only fueled speculation. Londoners observed the Tower of London with a new wariness. Its gates, which had welcomed Edward V as a prince and king in waiting, now seemed ominously closed, its towers darkened by secrecy. Courtiers whispered in hallways, careful not to offend the newly crowned king, but eager to understand what had become of the rightful heirs. The questions became harder to ignore as weeks turned into months. Nobles and influential citizens who had supported the Yorkist line grew anxious. The political stakes were enormous. The boys represented legitimacy, the continuation of Edward IV's dynasty, and a beacon for those who opposed Richard III. Their disappearance was not merely a private matter, it had national consequences. Fear mingled with anger, but no one dared openly confront the new king. Londoners spoke cautiously behind closed doors or in quiet corners, while chroniclers later recorded the growing unease in the capital. The city's questions, unanswered and mounting, highlighted the precariousness of Richard's rule. What had begun as a smooth succession was now overshadowed by suspicion, mistrust, and the first murmurs of one of England's most infamous mysteries, the fate of the princes in the Tower. After Richard III took the crown, an eerie stillness settled over the Tower of London. The once bustling royal residence, filled with attendants, courtiers, and ceremonial activity, became quiet and foreboding. Within its massive stone walls, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, remained unseen. The boys' disappearance was not marked by announcements, proclamations, or explanations. It was as if they had simply vanished. The silence itself became a statement, one that chilled observers and fueled endless speculation. The tower's chambers, where the princes had once studied and played, were now under strict control. Guards monitored every door and corridor, and those who had access to the boys were sworn to secrecy, or perhaps feared speaking out. The young princes were confined not only physically, but also socially. Their world had shrunk to the four walls of their rooms. Courtiers who previously attended them were sidelined, leaving the boys isolated from allies and family alike. Outside, London began to notice the absence, but official records remained silent. Richard III made no public acknowledgement of the prince's fate, and the tower's gates remained closed to curious eyes. This lack of transparency created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. The silence was not passive, it was deliberate, a tool of power that allowed the new king to consolidate control while keeping the nation uncertain and uneasy. Over time, the quiet of the tower became legendary. Chroniclers would later describe the emptiness, the sense of dread, and the unanswered questions that hung over the fortress. For the boys inside, the silence was suffocating. It marked the transition from childhood to a historical mystery, a place where innocence collided with ambition, and the absence of sound became a symbol of absence itself. In the tower, history waited silently, guarding secrets that may never be revealed. Decades after the disappearance of the princes in the tower, a chilling account emerged that would cast a shadow over Richard III's reign. According to later chronicles, Sir James Tyrrell, a trusted knight in the service of the king, confessed on his deathbed to carrying out the murders of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. Though the confession came long after the event, it became one of the central pieces of evidence historians have examined in attempting to solve England's greatest royal mystery. Tyrrell, a man known for his loyalty and military prowess, was allegedly ordered to remove the princes quietly, ensuring that Richard III's claim to the throne remained uncontested. The confession described how Tyrrell and his men entered the prince's chambers within the tower under the cover of night. The boys, innocent and unprepared, were said to have been murdered swiftly, their deaths hidden within the tower's vast stone walls. The story, horrifying in detail, suggested a calculated act of political expediency, one that secured a throne at the cost of two children's lives. Historians have debated the accuracy of Tyrrell's confession, which appears in sources written after the fall of Richard III and during the reign of the Tudors. Some argue it was Tudor propaganda, designed to demonize the last Yorkist king and legitimize Henry VII's claim. Others see it as plausible, given Richard's clear motive. The princes were the primary obstacles to his uncontested rule, and eliminating them would remove any rival claim. Whether fact or fabrication, the narrative of Tyrell's dark confession has shaped the story of the prince's fate for centuries. It paints a grim picture of ambition, loyalty, and the lengths men would go to secure power, ensuring that the mystery of the princes in the Tower remains one of England's most enduring and chilling historical enigmas. Among the many rumors surrounding the fate of the princes in the Tower, one story has endured in chilling detail: the tale of the pillow and the dagger. According to later accounts, the method of the prince's alleged murder was both intimate and terrifying, carried out within the very chambers meant to protect them. The narrative describes Sir James Tyrrell, acting on orders from Richard III, entering the boys' room under the cover of night. With cold efficiency, he is said to have smothered them using a pillow, a symbol of both domesticity and quiet violence, before completing the act with a dagger to ensure their deaths. The story, while horrifying, reflects more than just speculation about a method. It captures the intersection of innocence and ambition, vulnerability and power. The boys were children, entirely dependent on adults for their safety, yet the walls of the Tower that were supposed to shelter them became the setting for a crime calculated to remove obstacles to a crown. The pillow, an ordinary object, became a weapon, turning a place of rest into a site of terror. Historians have long debated the accuracy of this account. No contemporary records from 1483 confirm the method, and much of the narrative emerges in chronicles written after Richard III's defeat at Bosworth in 1485. Some scholars argue that it may have been Tudor propaganda designed to vilify Richard by portraying the murders as intimate and merciless. Others contend that even if details were exaggerated, the story reflects the real danger the princes faced, and the pillow and dagger imagery captured the imagination of later generations. Whether literal or symbolic, the tale remains one of the most haunting elements of the prince's story. It embodies the terror of childhood, caught in the machinations of adults, the cruelty of ambition, and the enduring mystery that surrounds the Tower of London. The pillow and the dagger have become an enduring symbol of a crime that may never be fully understood. One of the most enduring questions in English history is whether Richard III personally ordered the deaths of his nephews, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. The young princes had been confined in the Tower under his protection, and their sudden disappearance soon after his coronation fueled speculation, rumor, and fear. For centuries, historians have debated Richard's role. Was he a calculating usurper, or merely an unfortunate guardian ensnared by circumstance? Supporters of the theory that Richard ordered the murders point to motive and opportunity. The boys represented a direct threat to his claim to the throne. By eliminating them, Richard could secure his position as king without fear of Yorkist challengers. Chroniclers after the fall of Richard III, particularly those writing under the Tudors, describe a king who was ambitious and ruthless, willing to commit even the most heinous acts to hold power. These accounts, coupled with reports of Sir James Tyrrell allegedly carrying out the murders, suggest a deliberate plan orchestrated from the top. However, skeptics caution that evidence is circumstantial and heavily biased. Many sources come from Tudor-era chroniclers who had reason to demonize Richard III, portraying him as a villain to legitimize Henry VIII's claim. No contemporary document from Richard's reign explicitly orders harm to the princes. Some argue that the boys may have died from natural causes, been hidden, or fallen victim to factions acting independently of the king. Richard's silence on the matter, whether strategic or circumstantial, allowed suspicion to grow. The lack of public explanation and the boys' complete disappearance created fertile ground for speculation that persists to this day. Ultimately, the question of Richard III's involvement remains unanswered. Motive, opportunity, and later confessions suggest possibility, but the truth is lost to time. The mystery of whether Richard ordered the deaths of the princes in the Tower continues to haunt historians, leaving England's darkest royal intrigue unresolved. The mystery of the princes in the Tower hinges on three critical elements: motive, means, and opportunity. Each factor has been scrutinized by historians for centuries, forming the framework through which Richard III's potential culpability is analyzed. The motive is perhaps the clearest element. Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, were legitimate heirs to the throne, and their existence directly threatened Richard's claim. A child king could easily become a puppet for rival factions, undermining Gloucester's authority and ambitions. By removing the boys, Richard would eliminate any challenge to his rule, securing his position as king without the constant threat of a Yorkist resurgence. In a kingdom still haunted by civil war, the incentive for decisive, even brutal action was overwhelming. The means were equally accessible. As Lord Protector, Richard controlled the Tower of London, the very place where the princes were confined. Guards, attendants, and servants, many loyal to Gloucester or dependent on his favor, were positioned to carry out his orders. In a court steeped in secrecy and surveillance, the infrastructure for removing the boys discreetly existed. The tower, designed as both fortress and palace, provided the perfect setting: secure, isolated, and controlled. Opportunity also favored Richard. The boys were isolated from their maternal relatives, who had been arrested or exiled. Their circle of protection had been systematically dismantled, leaving them entirely in the hands of their uncle. Edward V and Richard of York were accessible, vulnerable, and dependent on the adults around them. Together, motive, means, and opportunity create a compelling, if unsettling, argument for Richard III's potential involvement. While absolute proof remains elusive, these three factors align with both contemporary suspicions and later historical analysis. They form the lens through which historians continue to examine one of England's darkest and most enduring mysteries: the fate of the princes in the Tower. While Richard III has long been accused of orchestrating the disappearance and likely murder of the princes in the Tower, a case exists for his possible innocence based on motive, circumstance, and historical context. Advocates of this view argue that the evidence against him is largely circumstantial, written decades later by Tudor chroniclers who had political reasons to tarnish his reputation. These sources depict Richard as ruthless and ambitious, but their accounts were often colored by the need to legitimize Henry VII's claim and discredit the last Yorkist king. One argument for Richard's innocence centers on motive, or the lack of a pressing need to kill the boys. Richard had already been appointed Lord Protector, controlling both the government and the young Edward V. A regency under his supervision would have given him almost all the powers of kingship without the stain of murdering nephews. Some historians suggest that the princes could have been safely kept in the Tower under his protection, ensuring loyalty to the crown
while remaining out of immediate danger. Circumstance also complicates the narrative. After Edward IV's death, England was politically unstable, and several factions, including the Woodvilles, posed threats not only to Richard, but to the kingdom itself. In such chaos, the disappearance of the boys could have been the result of other ambitious nobles or rogue actors seeking to manipulate the succession for their own advantage. Richard's ability to control every aspect of events was not absolute, particularly in a court rife with intrigue. Finally, there is no contemporary evidence directly linking Richard to the prince's deaths. No official order, eyewitness account, or document confirms his involvement, only later reports and confessions recorded under Tudor rule. These gaps in the historical record leave room for doubt. While motive, means, and opportunity suggest possibility, the case for Richard's innocence reminds us that history is often shaped as much by rumor and propaganda as by fact, and the true fate of the princes may never be fully known.
As the mystery of the princes in the Tower loomed over England, a new figure emerged who would ultimately reshape the nation's destiny: Henry Tudor. Born in 1457, Henry was a Lancastrian with a tenuous claim to the throne, descended through a minor branch of the royal family. Exiled in Brittany and France during the Wars of the Roses, he spent much of his early life as a political pawn, shielded from the deadly conflicts that had consumed England for decades. Henry's arrival on the English political stage coincided with growing dissatisfaction with Richard III's reign. The king's controversial ascent, coupled with the unresolved disappearance of the princes, had left many nobles uneasy. Supporters of the House of Lancaster, former Yorkists loyal to Edward IV, and disaffected members of the nobility all looked for a figure who could unite the country and provide stability. Henry, with his Lancastrian blood and personal charisma, became that figure. In 1485, Henry invaded England with a relatively small army but significant backing from key nobles and foreign allies. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Richard III was killed, marking the end of the Wars of the Roses. Henry's victory was not only military, but also symbolic. He claimed the crown as Henry VII, establishing a new dynasty that sought to heal a fractured kingdom. To solidify his rule and prevent future challenges, he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. This union symbolically ended decades of civil war and legitimized his claim in the eyes of the English people. Henry Tudor's rise illustrates how power in late medieval England was as much about perception, alliance, and opportunity as it was about bloodlines. In the shadow of the princes in the Tower, his victory brought both closure and a new beginning, ensuring that the mystery of the lost boys would forever be intertwined with the rise of the Tudor dynasty. One of the more provocative theories surrounding the princes in the Tower is the idea that Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, might have been responsible for their deaths. While Richard III is often blamed, some historians have considered the possibility that Henry had motive, means, and opportunity to eliminate the boys, ensuring that no rival Yorkist could challenge his claim to the throne once he became king. The motive is clear. By 1485, the princes were the legitimate Yorkist heirs. Even after Richard III's controversial coronation, Edward V and his brother remained symbols of Yorkist legitimacy. Had they survived, they could have become rallying points for opposition to Henry's Lancastrian claim. Removing them would have solidified his position after he defeated Richard at Bosworth Field, eliminating any lingering threats to the new Tudor dynasty. In terms of means, Henry had the resources to act. By the time he became king, He had the loyalty of key nobles, control over London, and access to agents who could move discreetly. The disappearance of the princes had left a void of certainty regarding their fate, and a clever manipulator could have concealed any evidence. Opportunity is less certain. The princes were last seen alive in 1483, 2 years before Henry defeated Richard III. While some suggest that Henry could have secretly orchestrated their deaths earlier, this is highly speculative and would have required coordination in a court dominated by Richard III and his allies. The theory remains controversial. Critics point out the lack of contemporary evidence implicating Henry, and that Tudor propaganda conveniently demonized Richard III, creating bias in the historical record. Nevertheless, the possibility that Henry VII played a role adds a chilling layer to the mystery. It reminds historians that the princes in the Tower were caught not just between ambition and power, but between men willing to do almost anything to claim a crown. Amid the dark rumors and chilling accounts of the princes in the Tower, one of the most intriguing theories is that the boys may not have been murdered at all. Several historical accounts suggest that Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, might have survived, perhaps hidden away by loyal supporters or escaped into obscurity. This possibility transforms the story from one of certain tragedy into a haunting tale of what might have been. One theory points to the mysterious Perkin Warbeck, who appeared in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. Warbeck gained support from foreign courts and English nobles, asserting that he had survived the Tower and was the rightful heir to the throne. While most historians today regard Warbeck as an impostor, the very fact that his claim gained traction underscores the uncertainty surrounding the prince's fate and the enduring hope that at least one may have lived. Other theories suggest that loyalists within the Tower, fearful for the boys' lives, may have secretly smuggled them out. In a kingdom rife with intrigue, some Yorkist supporters could have arranged a clandestine escape to a safe location, far from the eyes of Richard III or Henry VII. If so, the boys might have lived in anonymity, their identities erased to protect them from political retaliation. Even if these theories are unlikely, they reflect the deep human desire to imagine a happy ending amid the cruelty of ambition. The notion that Edward V and Richard could have survived transforms their story from a mere historical tragedy into a narrative of mystery, hope, and the enduring uncertainty of history. The princes in the Tower, whether dead or alive, remain symbols of innocence caught in the violent currents of power, their fate a riddle that continues to fascinate the world. Years after the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, a figure emerged who reignited speculation and hope across England, Perkin Warbeck. Claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the missing princes, Warbeck presented himself as the rightful heir to the Yorkist line, challenging Henry VII's fledgling Tudor dynasty. His appearance demonstrated how deeply the mystery of the prince's fate had unsettled England, leaving a vacuum that could be exploited by ambitious pretenders. Perkin's claim was initially taken seriously by foreign rulers. The King of France, the Duke of Burgundy, and other European powers lent him support, seeing an opportunity to destabilize Henry VII's rule. Warbeck cultivated a persona that resonated with Yorkist sympathizers, emphasizing his supposed lineage and the injustice done to him and his brother. His story reminded the public that Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, had vanished under suspicious circumstances, leaving many to wonder whether at least one prince had survived. Despite his efforts, Perkin's campaign ultimately failed. Henry VII's forces captured him, and, under interrogation, Warbeck confessed to being an impostor, though some contemporaries suggested that he might have been coerced or forced to admit the truth under pressure. Regardless of his authenticity, Warbeck's story had a lasting impact. It kept alive the question of the prince's fate and highlighted how their absence had created uncertainty and unrest in the kingdom. The saga of Perkin Warbeck illustrates the enduring power of the princes in the Tower as symbols. Their disappearance was more than a personal tragedy. It left England vulnerable to rumors, political manipulation, and challenges to the throne. Warbeck's claim, whether true or false, underscores how the unresolved fate of Edward V and Richard of York continued to shape English history long after Richard III's death, feeding one of the most enduring mysteries in the nation's past.
Centuries after the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, a startling discovery reignited public fascination and historical debate. In 1674, during renovations at the Tower of London, workmen uncovered a small box containing the skeletal remains of two children beneath a staircase. The bones were hastily buried in the chapel of St. John's within the tower, but their discovery immediately sparked speculation. Could these be the remains of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York? The circumstances of the find were as mysterious as the boys' disappearance. The staircase where the bones were discovered led to areas associated with the royal apartments, suggesting proximity to the prince's former quarters. Some historians argue that this supports the theory that the boys were murdered within the tower and their bodies concealed in a hidden location, perhaps by men loyal to Richard III or other political actors. The small size of the bones indicated that the children had been young, consistent with the ages of Edward V and Richard at the time of their disappearance. Yet the discovery also left questions unanswered. The bones were over a century old, and forensic methods of the 17th century were rudimentary. Identification was impossible, and no records documented the burial of the princes at the Tower. While many accepted the remains as the lost princes, skeptics suggested they could belong to other children who had died in the Tower over the centuries. In 1933, the bones were examined again, and in 1934 they were reburied in Westminster Abbey. Modern scientific techniques have never definitively confirmed their identity, leaving the mystery intact. The bones beneath the staircase serve as a haunting reminder of the princes in the Tower. They symbolize the enduring uncertainty surrounding Edward V and Richard, a tangible connection to a centuries-old enigma, and a chilling testament to how power, ambition, and secrecy shaped one of England's darkest historical mysteries. In 1678, the skeletal remains discovered beneath the staircase of the Tower of London were given a royal burial in Westminster Abbey, an event that was both solemn and enigmatic. Though centuries had passed since the disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, the ceremony acknowledged their potential identity while offering no answers about their fate. The boys were interred with honor, yet the circumstances of their deaths remained a mystery, leaving historians and the public with more questions than closure. The burial was conducted quietly, without the fanfare typical of royal ceremonies. The small size of the bones suggested they were indeed children, consistent with the ages of the missing princes. Despite the solemnity of the occasion, no contemporary records could confirm whether these were truly Edward V and Richard of York. The passage of time had erased direct evidence, and the Tower itself, once a place of protection and royal residence, had become a silent witness to the unresolved crime. For centuries, the royal interment highlighted the tension between respect for monarchy and the uncertainty surrounding history. It symbolized an attempt to honor potential victims of ambition and political intrigue, even without knowing the truth. The graves offered a physical site for remembrance,
Yet they could not satisfy the human desire for answers. How, when, and by whose hand had the princes disappeared? The royal burial underscored the enduring legacy of the princes in the Tower. Though laid to rest with dignity, the boys' fate remains one of England's greatest historical mysteries. Their story continues to captivate scholars and the public alike, a haunting reminder of the fragility of power, the ruthlessness of ambition, and the haunting silence that can follow when history refuses to provide closure. The burial offered respect, but no resolution, leaving the question of the prince's fate open to eternity. The discovery of two small skeletons beneath a staircase in the Tower of London in 1674 sparked centuries of intrigue. But it wasn't until the 20th century that early scientific examinations attempted to shed light on the identities of the remains. In 1933, the bones, then over 250 years old, were studied using the limited forensic techniques available at the time, including measurements of size and age estimation based on skeletal development. These analyses aimed to determine whether the remains could plausibly belong to Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. The skeletal examinations revealed that the bones belonged to two children, likely between the ages of 7 and 12, matching the ages of the princes when they disappeared in 1483. Observers noted the small stature of the skeletons, consistent with young boys, and the absence of obvious signs of trauma. However, the limitations of early forensic methods prevented any definitive conclusions. No DNA testing or advanced analysis was possible, and age and size estimates could only suggest plausibility rather than certainty. Historians and scientists debated the findings. Some argued that the skeletons strengthened the case that the princes had been murdered within the tower and concealed under the staircase. Others cautioned that many children had died in the tower over the centuries from illness or neglect, and the remains could belong to entirely unrelated victims. The absence of contemporary records detailing the burial or death of the princes left investigators with speculation rather than proof. The early examinations marked the beginning of a scientific approach to one of England's oldest mysteries. While they provided intriguing insights, they also highlighted the limits of technology in resolving centuries-old questions. The bones remained a symbol of uncertainty, fueling ongoing curiosity and debate about the fate of Edward V and Richard of York, whose story continues to captivate historians and the public alike. The mystery of the princes in the tower entered a new era with the advent of modern DNA technology. Scientists and historians began to ask a tantalizing question. Could genetic testing finally reveal whether the skeletal remains discovered in the Tower of London in 1674 were truly Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York? This possibility raised hopes that centuries of uncertainty might be resolved with scientific precision. The challenge, however, was immense. The remains had been reburied in Westminster Abbey in 1934, and any attempt at testing required careful exhumation and legal approval from the monarchy and the Church of England. Additionally, DNA degradation over hundreds of years, combined with the risk of contamination, meant that testing would be difficult and results might remain inconclusive. Researchers also needed comparative DNA from living descendants of the royal line to verify identities, a task complicated by centuries of intermarriage and the extinction of some lines. Despite these obstacles, the DNA question captured the imagination of historians, scientists, and the public. If successful, testing could answer one of England's greatest historical mysteries, whether the two boys who vanished in 1483 had been murdered in the tower or survived in some unknown way. It could confirm or refute theories implicating Richard III, Henry VII, or other political actors, and provide definitive closure to a centuries-old story that has fascinated generations. Even without conclusive results, the pursuit of DNA analysis underscores the evolving methods historians use to interrogate the past. From chronicles and rumors to archaeology and genetics, the story of the princes in the tower illustrates how science and history intersect. The DNA question represents humanity's enduring desire to uncover truth, bridging the centuries between the lives of two young princes and the modern world that still wonders what became of them. Despite centuries of fascination with the fate of the princes in the tower, modern scientific tests, especially DNA analysis, have never been fully conducted on the skeletal remains discovered in 1674. The reasons for this are complex, combining legal, ethical, religious, and practical concerns that have kept the mystery firmly unresolved. First, the remains are interred in Westminster Abbey, a sacred site and active place of worship. Exhuming human remains from such a location requires permissions not only from the monarchy, but also from the Church of England. These approvals are difficult to obtain, particularly for remains that may be of royal significance. Even a minor disturbance could be considered a breach of religious and cultural respect, making authorities cautious about granting access. Second, the potential scientific challenges are daunting. The bones have been buried for centuries and were handled multiple times over the years, which increases the likelihood of DNA contamination. Furthermore, extracting usable DNA from such old remains is technically difficult. Any results would be tentative, potentially inconclusive, and subject to debate, raising questions about whether the disruption of the burial is justified. Third, there is political and historical sensitivity surrounding the project. If the tests were to suggest that the remains were not the prince's, or worse, if they indicated wrongdoing by Richard III, there could be significant implications for historical narratives and royal legacies. This adds another layer of caution for those responsible for permitting such research. Finally, competing historical priorities and resources have delayed efforts. While forensic scientists and historians are eager to pursue the truth, other projects often take precedence, and funding for such delicate work is limited. Together, these factors explain why, more than 500 years after the princes disappeared, science has yet to provide definitive answers. The combination of respect, technical difficulty, and political sensitivity ensures that the fate of Edward V and Richard of York remains one of England's most enduring historical mysteries. The story of the princes in the Tower has been shaped as much by propaganda as by fact, particularly under the Tudor dynasty. After Henry VII claimed the throne in 1485, the new rulers had a vested interest in legitimizing their reign and discrediting Richard III, the last Yorkist king. By portraying Richard as a ruthless usurper and murderer of his nephews, Tudor chroniclers created a powerful narrative that justified Henry's claim and painted the former king as morally unfit to rule. Tudor propaganda was carefully constructed through literature, chronicles, and commissioned histories. Writers like Thomas More and Polydore Vergil depicted Richard III as a villain, emphasizing cruelty, ambition, and treachery. The disappearance of Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, became a central element of this story, symbolizing the dangers of unchecked ambition. In these accounts, Richard's alleged crimes provided moral and political justification for Henry VII's accession and the unification of the warring houses of Lancaster and York through marriage. The power of this propaganda extended beyond the court. By influencing public perception, It shaped the collective memory of the prince's fate for generations. Stories of the tower, the pillow and dagger, and the secret murders were repeated in plays, chronicles, and poems, embedding Richard III in history as a villain. This narrative was reinforced by the Tudor regime's control of education, patronage, and public ceremonies, ensuring that the version of events favorable to the Tudors became widely accepted. Even today, historians must grapple with the effects of Tudor propaganda. Separating fact from politically motivated fiction is challenging, particularly because contemporary records from Richard's reign are scarce. The enduring image of Richard III as the murderer of the princes in the Tower illustrates how propaganda can shape history, creating a story that resonates across centuries and continues to influence our understanding of one of England's greatest unsolved mysteries. The story of the princes in the Tower demonstrates one of history's most enduring truths. It is often written by the victors. After the fall of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, Henry VII and the newly established Tudor dynasty controlled the narrative of England's recent past. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, became a powerful tool in shaping public perception, allowing the Tudors to legitimize their rule and cast their predecessor in a dark, villainous light. Richard III, once a king with legitimate claims and supporters, was portrayed as a cruel and ambitious murderer, responsible for the deaths of his nephews. Chroniclers like Sir Thomas More and Polydore Virgil wrote accounts emphasizing his alleged crimes, portraying the young princes as innocent victims of his ruthless ambition. These narratives were widely disseminated and accepted by the public, embedding the idea of Richard as a usurper and murderer deeply into English history. The history written by the victors effect extended beyond literature. It shaped political propaganda, art, plays, and even royal ceremonies, reinforcing the moral authority of the Tudor dynasty. By emphasizing Richard's supposed villainy, Henry VII framed his victory not merely as a military triumph, but as a moral restoration. The fate of the princes, shrouded in secrecy and rumor, became a symbol of the consequences of illegitimate power, ensuring that the Tudors' legitimacy would go largely unquestioned. Modern historians face the challenge of untangling fact from Tudor-influenced fiction. With few contemporary records from Richard III's reign, the line between evidence and propaganda is blurred. The prince's story reminds us that history is not always impartial. It is shaped by those in power. In the case of the Tower, it left a lasting enigma, a tale of ambition, betrayal, and innocence lost, forever filtered through the lens of the victors.
Beyond their personal tragedy, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, came to symbolize far more than themselves in English history. The princes in the Tower represent the vulnerability of innocence caught in the crossfire of political ambition, the fragility of legitimacy in a turbulent kingdom, and the consequences of power unchecked by morality. Their disappearance transcended mere history. It became a cautionary tale, a symbol embedded in the national consciousness. In the years following their disappearance, the princes were invoked by chroniclers, playwrights, and artists as emblems of lost innocence and the dangers of tyranny. They represented the human cost of civil strife. The Wars of the Roses had already devastated England, and their unresolved fate illustrated how children, symbols of continuity and hope, could become victims in the struggle for power. By embodying the stakes of political conflict, the princes became a moral touchstone, reminding rulers and subjects alike of the responsibility inherent in authority. The symbolism of the Tower itself reinforced their role as icons.
Once a royal palace and fortress, it transformed in the public imagination into a site of fear, betrayal, and secrecy. The princes, confined within its walls, became inseparable from the idea of political imprisonment and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Literature and art, from Tudor chronicles to Shakespearean drama, amplified this symbolism, ensuring that the prince's story endured even as the facts remained elusive. Even in modern times, Edward V and Richard continue to serve as symbols in historical and cultural discourse. They are reminders of the consequences of political manipulation, the vulnerability of the powerless, and the enduring mysteries of history. Their story is not only a historical event, but also a lens through which generations have explored themes of innocence, legitimacy, ambition, and morality. Themes that remain as relevant today as they were over 5 centuries ago. The Tower of London, centuries after its construction, had already gained a reputation as a place of imprisonment, intrigue, and power struggles. Yet the disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, solidified its reputation as a site of England's darkest mysteries. The fate of the princes in the Tower transformed the fortress from a royal residence and defensive stronghold into a symbol of political ruthlessness and hidden violence. Before the princes, the Tower had witnessed arrests, imprisonments, and even executions, but the case of Edward and Richard was uniquely chilling because the victims were children and heirs to the throne. Their confinement highlighted the fragility of royal succession in a kingdom still reeling from civil war. The Tower's walls, meant to protect the monarchy, instead became associated with betrayal and fear. This duality, shelter and prison, safety and menace, would become a defining element of the Tower's legacy. The prince's story also left a lasting imprint on the perception of monarchy and power in England. The Tower became synonymous with the danger of unchecked ambition, where political necessity could override morality. Generations of Londoners, visitors, and historians came to view it as a place where innocence could vanish without explanation and where secrecy cloaked the actions of those in power. Over time, the Tower's dark legacy extended beyond the princes. Later prisoners, from Anne Boleyn to Guy Fawkes, contributed to the building's ominous reputation. But the memory of Edward V and Richard remains the most haunting. Their unresolved fate transformed the Tower from a physical fortress into a symbol of historical uncertainty, a reminder of ambition's human cost. The story of the princes in the Tower ensures that the fortress is remembered not merely as a landmark, but as a monument to one of England's most enduring and chilling mysteries. One of the most frustrating aspects of the Princes in the Tower mystery is the silence of those who may have witnessed the events surrounding Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York. Many individuals had access to the boys, from attendants and servants to guards and courtiers, yet remarkably little contemporary testimony exists. This absence of direct eyewitness accounts has fueled centuries of speculation and made it nearly impossible for historians to reconstruct exactly what happened within the Tower. Some argue that those who were present may have been too afraid to speak out. The Tower was under the control of Richard III, a powerful and politically savvy figure. Anyone suspected of disloyalty or of revealing sensitive information could have faced imprisonment, loss of property, or even death. In a climate of fear and political instability, silence may have seemed the only safe choice. Courtiers and guards may have witnessed suspicious activity, but the threat of reprisal likely prevented any testimony from reaching the public or official records. Others suggest that some witnesses may have been complicit, either out of loyalty to Richard III or personal ambition. By remaining silent, they avoided drawing attention to themselves while ensuring that the king's position remained secure. This combination of fear, loyalty, and opportunism created a veil of secrecy, leaving the prince's fate obscured even to those closest to them. The absence of testimony has profound consequences for history. Without first-hand accounts, historians must rely on chronicles written after the fact, often influenced by Tudor propaganda or hearsay. This lack of concrete evidence ensures that the disappearance of Edward V and Richard remains one of England's greatest unsolved mysteries. The silence of the eyewitnesses, whether born of fear or complicity, allowed the shadow of uncertainty to envelop the Tower and the story of the lost princes for centuries. Among the many theories surrounding the fate of the princes in the Tower, one possibility that is often overlooked is that Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, may have died of natural causes. While murder dominates popular imagination, the harsh realities of 15th century England meant that illness and disease were constant threats, even to royalty. The Tower of London, though secure and imposing, was not immune to infection, poor sanitation, and inadequate medical knowledge. The princes were confined in a relatively small and crowded space, isolated from their family and traditional caregivers. This environment could have facilitated the spread of illnesses such as pneumonia, influenza, or even more severe childhood diseases like measles or tuberculosis. In an era before modern medicine, even a minor infection could prove fatal, and young children, Edward was 12, Richard only 10, were especially vulnerable. Historical accounts of the Tower suggest that it was not always a healthy environment. Reports from later periods describe damp chambers, cold stone floors, and minimal ventilation. Even if the boys were attended by loyal servants, the combination of confinement, stress, and inadequate nutrition could have compromised their immune systems, making them susceptible to fatal illnesses. If the princes died of natural causes, it would explain the lack of contemporary records and the absence of visible violence on the skeletal remains discovered in 1674. Their disappearance would have been tragic but unintentional, an unfortunate result of circumstance rather than deliberate malice. This theory reminds historians and the public that not all historical mysteries are the product of intrigue or ambition. Sometimes, fate and human vulnerability play a role. Whether by assassination, exile, or illness, the ultimate fate of Edward V and Richard of York remains unknown. Their story, a haunting reflection of the precariousness of childhood and power in medieval England. One of the greatest obstacles to solving the mystery of the princes in the Tower is the problem of missing evidence. Despite the significance of Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, in English history, there are virtually no contemporary documents that clearly explain what happened to them. The lack of eyewitness accounts, official records, or forensic proof leaves historians to rely on rumor, later chronicles, and circumstantial clues, an imperfect and often contradictory historical record. The Tower of London itself, a site of royal power and political intrigue, became a sealed environment after Richard III assumed the throne. Access to the princes was restricted, and attendants, guards, and courtiers who might have known something were either silenced by fear or complicit in secrecy. Any records that might have existed were likely destroyed, hidden, or never created. Without these primary sources, the foundation of the investigation is weak, leaving historians to speculate based on the motivations of the era's key players rather than hard evidence. Moreover, physical evidence is limited and ambiguous. The skeletal remains found beneath a staircase in 1674 offered tantalizing clues, But without modern DNA testing and with centuries of handling and relocation, their identity remains uncertain. Even the testimony of later figures, such as Sir James Tyrrell's alleged confession, is disputed and potentially influenced by political bias or the passage of time. This absence of evidence highlights a central challenge of studying medieval history. Secrecy, power, and fear often suppressed truth, leaving future generations with questions that may never be answered. The missing evidence in the case of the princes ensures that every theory, murder, illness, or escape, remains plausible yet unproven. It is this void that keeps the princes in the Tower as one of England's most enduring and haunting historical mysteries. One of the key challenges in solving the mystery of the princes in the Tower is the relentless passage of time and the natural decay of evidence. Over 5 centuries have passed since Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, vanished within the walls of the Tower of London. In that time, documents have been lost, oral accounts have been forgotten or distorted, and physical evidence has deteriorated. This erosion of information makes it nearly impossible to determine with certainty what happened to the young princes. Time has affected both the historical record and the physical remains. Chronicles written decades after the events were often influenced by political bias, especially under the Tudors, meaning they may exaggerate or fabricate details to serve a particular narrative. Eyewitness testimony, if it ever existed, has long disappeared, leaving only rumor and conjecture. Even the skeletal remains discovered in 1674 have been handled, moved, and reburied multiple times, further complicating any attempt at modern forensic analysis. DNA testing, which might provide answers, is challenging because of degradation over centuries and potential contamination, making definitive identification difficult. Decay also applies to the tower itself. Rooms, staircases, and chambers have been altered, rebuilt, or demolished, erasing the physical context in which the princes lived and may have died. This loss of the original environment obscures crucial clues about how events might have unfolded and how access to the princes could have been controlled. Ultimately, the role of time and decay ensures that the princes in the tower remain an enigma. Historical documents, physical evidence, and even the memory of those who lived through the events have all been eroded, leaving gaps that can never fully be reconstructed. The mystery endures because time has claimed the answers, leaving only speculation, theory, and the haunting question: what truly happened to Edward V and Richard of York?
More than 5 centuries after the disappearance of the princes in the Tower, historians remain deeply divided over their fate. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, vanished from public view in 1483, and no contemporary records definitively explain what happened. The debate continues to split scholars into camps: those who believe Richard III orchestrated their deaths, those who suspect Henry VII or other political actors, and those who argue the princes may have died of illness or even survived in secret. Supporters of Richard III's culpability point to motive, means, and opportunity. The boys represented the most direct challenge to his claim to the throne, and as Lord Protector, he had full control over the Tower of London and the people around the princes. Chroniclers after his death, particularly Tudor writers like Sir Thomas More, portrayed Richard as ruthless and ambitious, reinforcing the idea that he ordered the murders. However, skeptics argue that these accounts are heavily biased, written to justify Henry VII's reign and vilify his predecessor. No contemporary document directly implicates Richard, and the alleged confession of Sir James Tyrrell, supposedly admitting to the murders, comes decades later and may be unreliable.
Other theories suggest Henry VII could have had motive to eliminate potential Yorkist rivals, though opportunity is less clear. A smaller group of historians contends that the princes may have died of disease or other natural causes, noting that the Tower was not a particularly healthy environment for children in the 15th century. The divisions among historians highlight the complexity of interpreting incomplete evidence. Every surviving record is fragmentary, and much of what is known is filtered through Tudor propaganda, rumor, or later retellings. This uncertainty ensures that the story of Edward V and Richard remains one of England's most compelling and enduring historical mysteries. The debate is likely to continue, keeping the princes in the Tower an unsolved enigma for generations to come. The story of the princes in the Tower is not only a tale of political intrigue and ambition, it is also a stark reminder of the human cost of power. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, were children caught in the deadly currents of succession, ambition, and the ruthless pursuit of authority. Their disappearance illustrates how innocence can become collateral damage in a world dominated by adults vying for control. The boys' confinement in the Tower of London, a space meant to protect them, ultimately left them vulnerable. Stripped of parental guidance and surrounded by adults whose loyalties were shaped by ambition, they were entirely dependent on the very figures who may have sought to exploit or eliminate them. Their vulnerability underscores the personal cost of political games, where the desires of kings and courtiers can overshadow compassion, justice, and morality. Beyond the princes themselves, the human cost extended to those around them. Servants, attendants, and even family members were caught in webs of secrecy and fear, forced into silence or complicity to survive. The emotional toll on the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and other relatives is immeasurable, grief compounded by uncertainty and powerlessness. The psychological dimensions of such events are rarely recorded, yet they were undoubtedly profound, illustrating the ripple effects of political ambition on human lives. The story of Edward and Richard reminds us that history is shaped not only by kings and battles, but by the lives affected, often tragically, by the decisions of those in power. The prince's unresolved fate magnifies this human dimension, turning a political mystery into a moral lesson about the dangers of ambition unchecked. In remembering the princes in the Tower, we confront both the intrigue of history and the profound human cost that ambition can exact on the innocent. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, remains one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in English history. Often referred to as England's greatest unsolved murder, the case combines elements of political ambition, secrecy, and tragedy, leaving historians and the public alike grappling with unanswered questions for over 5 centuries. Despite extensive research, the fate of the princes, last seen in the Tower of London in 1483, has never been conclusively determined. The intrigue begins with the political context. Following the death of Edward IV, his 12-year-old son, Edward V, was meant to ascend the throne. His uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector, ostensibly to safeguard the young king. Yet within months, Richard declared Edward and his brother illegitimate, took the crown as Richard III, and confined the boys to the Tower, a place meant for their protection, yet later associated with fear and secrecy. Their sudden disappearance sparked immediate suspicion, with many believing that Richard, motivated by ambition, ordered their deaths to secure his claim. However, the lack of contemporary evidence complicates the narrative. There are no first-hand accounts or official records confirming the prince's deaths, and later sources, often written under Tudor rule, may reflect political bias designed to discredit Richard III. Other theories suggest Henry VII, illness, or even clandestine escape as possible explanations, each with its own plausibility but no definitive proof. The unresolved nature of their disappearance, coupled with the mystery surrounding who may have been responsible, elevates the case beyond a historical tragedy. The story of the princes in the Tower endures because it encapsulates ambition, innocence, secrecy, and the fragility of power. To this day, England and the world remains haunted by the question, what truly happened to the young heirs whose lives vanished behind the Tower's walls, leaving one of history's greatest puzzles unsolved?
Centuries after their disappearance, Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, continue to capture the imagination of historians, writers, and the public. Though their lives were tragically cut short or lost to history, the princes are remembered not only as historical figures, but as symbols of innocence, mystery, and the human cost of power. Memorials, literature, and popular culture have ensured that their story remains alive, keeping their memory in the collective consciousness. In Westminster Abbey, where the skeletal remains discovered in the Tower of London were interred in 1934, visitors can reflect on the tragic legacy of the princes. Though definitive identification is impossible, the reburial offers a solemn tribute, acknowledging the young lives that may have been lost. Their story also resonates through literature, from Tudor chronicles to modern historical novels, plays, and documentaries. Writers have explored the princes' vulnerability, the political intrigue surrounding their disappearance, and the haunting possibilities of survival, creating a rich cultural tapestry that extends far beyond mere historical fact. The princes are also remembered as cautionary figures. Their fate serves as a reminder of how innocence can become entangled in political ambition and how power struggles can have devastating consequences for those caught in the middle. In schools, museums, and historical tours of the Tower, their story is recounted as both a compelling mystery and a moral lesson about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Even today, public fascination remains undiminished. Discussions of Richard III, Henry VII, and even Perkin Warbeck continually reference the princes, demonstrating the lasting impact of their disappearance. Edward V and Richard of York may never have ruled, but they endure in memory, a testament to lost potential, enduring mystery, and the human stories behind history's grand narratives. The princes in the Tower are remembered not only as victims, but as enduring symbols of intrigue, innocence, and historical uncertainty. The disappearance of Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, remains one of history's most compelling enigmas. Centuries of investigation, speculation, and analysis have failed to uncover definitive answers. Despite the discovery of skeletal remains, alleged confessions, and countless chronicles, the truth about what happened to the princes in the Tower may be lost forever. This uncertainty fuels fascination, allowing historians, writers, and the public to debate, theorize, and imagine possibilities that range from murder to natural death, or even secret survival. Part of the difficulty lies in the scarcity of contemporary evidence. Few first-hand accounts exist, and those that do are filtered through bias, fear, or political agenda. Tudor-era chroniclers, for example, portrayed Richard III as a villain, ensuring their narrative served the newly established monarchy. Later accounts, such as Sir James Tyrrell's supposed confession, emerged decades after the events and remain unverified. Even the skeletal remains discovered in 1674 cannot provide conclusive answers. Centuries of handling and the lack of modern DNA comparison to confirmed royal descendants
leave their identity uncertain. The political climate of 15th century England further obscures the truth. A kingdom embroiled in civil war and factional rivalry made secrecy and conspiracy commonplace. Decisions were driven by survival, ambition, and strategy, not transparency. Anyone who might have known the facts had strong incentives to remain silent, or worse, could have been removed entirely. Will we ever know what truly happened? Perhaps not. The lack of definitive evidence, the passage of time, and the deliberate secrecy surrounding the prince's confinement create a mystery resistant to resolution. Yet it is precisely this uncertainty that has immortalized Edward V and Richard of York. Their story transcends history, becoming a timeless tale of ambition, innocence, and unanswered questions, one that continues to haunt the Tower of London and the imagination of the world.
The story of the princes in the Tower concludes not with answers, but with echoes. Echoes that reverberate through the walls of the Tower of London, through the pages of history, and through the imagination of generations. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, vanished over 5 centuries ago, yet their absence continues to haunt England. Their fate remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, a riddle wrapped in ambition, secrecy, and tragedy. The Tower itself has become more than a fortress or royal residence. It stands as a monument to uncertainty, power, and human vulnerability. The stones that once confined the princes now hold centuries of speculation, rumor, and sorrow. Visitors can walk its corridors, imagine the footsteps of young boys, and feel the tension that once gripped the kingdom. The walls silently testify to the fragility of life, the weight of legitimacy, and the human cost of ambition. Even without certainty, the prince's story has shaped culture, literature, and historical inquiry. From Tudor chronicles to modern novels, documentaries, and films, Edward and Richard continue to inspire fascination and reflection. They have become symbols of innocence caught in the storm of power, reminders of how history can be both a record and a mystery. Ultimately, the princes in the Tower endure because of what is unknown. Their vanished lives, unanswered questions, and the shadow of what might have been give their story lasting power. The Tower's stones may never reveal the truth, but through them, the echoes of Edward V and Richard of York continue to resonate. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to keep history alive and explore more mysteries from the past.